Welcome to The Quantum State, a podcast exploring the latest research and innovation in quantum computing. Join us as we dive into groundbreaking breakthroughs, trends, and news shaping the quantum landscape. Discover the cutting-edge developments pushing the boundaries of computing technology. Through insightful discussions, expert interviews, and in-depth analysis, we unravel the intricate theories and real-world applications driving this transformative field. The Quantum State also offers updates from BTQ, sharing the company's research progress and innovative products at the forefront of quantum computing. So, embark on this mind-bending journey with us as we navigate the realm of quantum computing, witnessing its potential to revolutionize our world. Welcome back to The Quantum State. So today I have Dr. Peter Rohde and Dr. Gavin Brennan to talk a little bit more like we did last time. The last roundtable episode, we talked about quantum vulnerabilities. We talked about RSA and elliptic curve being broken by encryption. Now today we're going to dive a little bit more into the mitigation strategies. First, I want us to clarify one big question about mitigation. We mentioned AES being weakened on the last episode. So if we can just double the key size there, why wouldn't we just use AES for everything?
Well, the reason is that AES belongs to a particular class of cryptography, which is symmetric key cryptography. And that class of cryptography is one where you use the same key to both encrypt and decrypt data. And what that means is that if you want to communicate with someone using AES or something similar, you have to find some way of meeting them in the equivalent of a dark back alley to secretly exchange those keys. And sometimes that's all right. If you're speaking to your best friend, you can go pay them a visit and exchange a key. But if you want to access a website on the other side of the world that you've never interacted with before, well, it's not really practical to do that. And the internet relies a lot on communicating with people with whom you haven't communicated before. And that requires a different type of cryptography, which is public key cryptography. And there you have two different keys, one only usable for encryption, the other one only for decryption. And you make the one that's only useful for encryption public, so anyone can encrypt something for you to read, but you're the only one who can decrypt it. So because AES doesn't fit into that category of really useful cryptographic protocols, it's inherently much more limited in what it can do.
And would you say maybe this is a rough estimate, I'm not sure there's stats on that, but most things are encrypted with public key cryptography. Do we have a percentage there?
Well, that's hard to know what the percentage is, but the answer is on the internet, it's ubiquitous. Any time that you're interacting with someone with whom you haven't had the capacity to secretly agree upon a key with them, and let's face it, that's probably everybody on the internet that you've ever interacted with. I've never done that in my life, had to secretly exchange something with someone. Everything we do on the internet is relying on public keys. So whatever the percentage is, when it comes to the internet, with its very open design by nature, it's very fundamental. But that isn't to say that governments, for example, don't use it, where they have other ways of exchanging keys that aren't practical for you and me.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about Grover's algorithm here. So that's another misconception that we get all the time. A lot of people think that it can search anything faster. So are we really seeing this as a big threat to quantum technology and encryption particularly?
Yeah, so that's a really important point. Like, in a very broad sense, when people talk about quantum algorithms, frequently they just mean quantum algorithms of the search type, which is Grover, or period finding, which is Shor. And then there's a lot of different options. In fact, there's several others, but at a very high level, those are two kind of good schemes to think of for quantum algorithms. And it's true that Grover's algorithm does give you a quadratic speedup in unstructured search. So that's where you want to find, for example, let's say you can easily apply a function on a bunch of strings. So maybe you want to know, well, in a relevant case for like Bitcoin mining, you want to find a string whose hash is less than some number. And that's a search problem because you basically have to try over all the different strings you can put in there to get that output that you want as a target. And Grover's algorithm does give you a quadratic speedup. And this could also be used for, cracking cryptography, where you just want to, try different strings which you suspect could be a private key to give you the right indicator for being able to then, go off and, cheat or steal money or pretend you're someone else. The quadratic speedup is important, but it comes with overheads. So, quantum computers are actually slower than classical computers in terms of their clock cycle speed. So, a standard laptop, 3.5 gigahertz. And a quantum computer's clock speed is determined not just by the fundamental interactions between the quantum bits, the qubits, but also the error correction cycle time. When you include that, for some of the most promising technologies, we're talking about clock cycle speeds of maybe 100 megahertz. So, factor of 30 slower. And it might be a little bit faster in some technologies than others, but you're going to get a hit on that. And then there's also a lot of extra steps you have to do beyond just the straight counting of the gates in a Grover's algorithm due to error correction. So if you do a careful look, actually, in many cases, you don't get a realistic benefit from Grover until quantum computers reach the level of hundreds of millions of qubits, which is going to be quite a while away. And even then, just taking a mitigation strategy of doubling the key length is still not necessarily the smartest thing to do, because whereas you will be able to slow down what can be done with quantum computers, when they do reach a big enough size, then you have issues like, because Grover's algorithm basically does a rotation from a completely disordered state, which is a sum over all possible bit strings, to the target state, which you're looking for, you have some time in between where you have a chance of finding the solution. And so you might have situations where people can find the answer to the problem before they finish their algorithm. And so we really want to find techniques which go beyond just doubling key lengths in order to have some security.
And I think that's a really good point, because when we're talking about a quadratic speedup, we're also talking about with the worst possible search that we could do classically, right? Because, for example, collision functions would be coming close to the same level as Grover's algorithm, I believe. I think that there was a paper a few years ago saying that it would be about the same case. So there could be classical improvements in search, and obviously there's search, different types of searches that can be faster than just pure one-by-one linear search.
I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, this quadratic improvement that you get, that we talk about for Grover, that's specifically in the worst case scenario where you're dealing with data that you're trying to find something, but there's no structure at all. So imagine you've got a big list of data and it's completely randomized, the order. And then classically, the best thing you can do is just go through one by one. But as soon as there is some structure and lots of data, most data does have some kind of structure to it, then you can start exploiting it, at least in part, to get classical improvements. And it just isn't the case that every type of search problem you would immediately get a benefit from Grover. It might very well be the case, and will often be the case, that there are actually substructures that you can take advantage of that allow you to get a classical gain that's much better than what you could get from the quadratic Grover improvement in the worst case unstructured case.
And I think there's another good point around, well, you were talking about the rotation, Gavin, but as an experimentalist, people tell me, well, you just do the search, like put it onto the quantum state. And my question is, how do you do that with a string? Like, actually, when you think about that, right, this is why VQE, variational quantum eigensolver, and quantum chemistry is so natural for quantum computers, because they're already quantum states, and that's a very easy mapping. And here, even if Grover's algorithm was faster, how do you actually put that state? How do you put numbers or a string onto a quantum state?
Yeah, so that's a good point. Like, if you look at it, quantum computers are very good at certain tasks because, in a sense, they can represent data in a sparse way. So, one of the prototypical examples of a speed up in quantum computers is the quantum Fourier transform, which there's the famous fast Fourier transform in classical computing, which has a scaling that's n log n for n the size of some vector. And in quantum, it's just log n squared. So that's an exponential improvement. And that's really coming down to the fact that quantum devices, using whatever representation of data you use, like we would use qubits, they can perform this transformation to a conjugate basis that's like the Fourier basis very efficiently. And nature does this all the time. It works, in conjugate bases with interactions in chemical interactions. So using quantum computers for simulations of things which already occur in nature is in some sense quite natural. Whereas some of the cryptographic strategies are not so natural. The magic is that Shor found this particular case of period finding for cracking factoring-based algorithms or elliptic curve algorithms based on the discrete log, where you also get this really nice power of quantum computing. And so, a lot of the effort in post-quantum crypto is to find problems where quantum computers don't have a natural mapping, which gives you a compressed representation of data.
All right. So now that we've talked about those things and everyone can kind of lay off saying that we're doing useless work because we can just use AES, let's talk about the differences between quantum and post-quantum cryptography.
So, the differences, the big difference is in the name, whether it's vulnerable to quantum computing or not. And our current day public key systems certainly are, and that motivates all of this effort into finding new ones that aren't. Beyond that, the differences are very, very specific to the different types of implementations. And there isn't a single answer. It depends very much on which approach you're using. So, for example, one of the approaches that can be used for post-quantum public key signatures is hash-based cryptography. And hash-based cryptography for digital signatures is one where the only security assumption that's made in that theoretical model is that hash functions are strong. That is, that they have pre-image resistance, which means if you have a hash function and it gives you an output, it's very difficult to infer what the input might have been. There could be multiple possible inputs that gives the same output, but finding any of them is very, very hard. And that's the only assumption really when it comes to hash-based digital signatures. And it's believed that hash functions are very strong in that sense. We've had them for a very probably, of all of our cryptographic primitives, probably the ones that have the strongest security assumptions. However, hash-based digital signatures, despite the fact that they have quite strong security assumptions, they create these enormous signature systems that have huge memory footprints, and therefore you just wouldn't want them for every sort of application. So that motivated searches for other ways of doing it, which led to things like lattice-based cryptography, which is a completely different type of mathematical approach using very, very different underlying structures, not hash functions at all, instead lattice-based transformations, which is basically sort of higher dimensional matrix transformations that obey certain properties. Whether they're post-quantum or not, I mean, nobody can prove these things. That's the problem. A lot of it comes down to how long have we been looking at these things as a sort of guide to how convinced we are as to their strength. They could be proven wrong at any point in time, just like RSA was when Peter Shaw suddenly made that discovery. So the implementations differ enormously. Hash-based signatures, presumably very, very strong based on our understanding. Lattice-based methods, different assumptions. I'm not the one to be able to answer whether they're actually post-quantum or not, but they do have the advantage that they have much smaller keys, that they're much more reusable, they're more efficient. So there are always these trade-offs between things, and that's exactly why NIST, the organization in the United States that's standardizing lots of these protocols, that's the reason that they're standardizing multiple different types of ones rather than just one and saying everybody should use this. It's because there are trade-offs. There are always unknowns. Nobody ever proves these things. It's very much, there are a lot of assumptions in all of these things. And so choosing the best type of technique really comes down to keeping all of these things in mind and deciding what the best trade-off is for a given type of application.
Yeah, just to get to your question about the distinction between quantum cryptography and post-quantum cryptography. Yeah, so this can be oftentimes confusing if you're not in the field. And in fact, people in the field sometimes confuse it. Quantum cryptography is usually referring to the idea of making a method for secure communications based upon quantum communication resources. So really using qubits. And in the original protocol of Bennett and Broussard in 1984, this famous BB84 protocol, they used single photons to send data which would allow you to do some processing and prepare a key that would be shared between two parties, Alice and Bob. And again, the basic principle can be understood using your hand. So like you have a 0 and a 1, say, described by my thumb and my forefinger. And that's one choice of basis to send information. So that might be like the 0 might be a kind of polarization of the photon along this thumb direction of the forefinger. And another choice of basis is rotated by 45 degrees. And when communicating between Alice and Bob, they actually send these quantum photons. Sometimes the sender, Alice, will choose this basis and sometimes this basis. And the fundamental feature of quantum mechanics is that you can't distinguish this basis and this basis perfectly. We can do it classically because you can see I've rotated my hand, but when you get down to a level of individual quantum systems, those bases are what we call incompatible. You can't get exact measurements which can distinguish one from the other. And the fact that they're incompatible means that if some eavesdropper, they always call it Eve, grabbed some of those photons and measured them and said, oh, okay, now I know what Alice was trying to send, and then maybe sends off those information, resends it to the receiver, Bob, when Alice and Bob communicate, Alice will see, oh, Bob is not matching my actual results on enough of those subset of that message string. And so they'll know that either there was a malicious eavesdropper or maybe it was a bad channel, and they'll just terminate and restart. And they showed, and very nicely, that in fact, by doing a long enough string of these things, you can actually prepare with very high confidence a shared key between Alice and Bob, and that's really a symmetric key. And so, this was one of the first quantum technologies that really took off. In fact, there were companies that have been around since the early 90s doing this. But it does require you send these quantum bits between parties. And quantum bits are kind of fragile. If we had a good way to do it, we'd be doing it all the time. And it requires special infrastructure. You either have to have, very high quality waveguides for the photons to travel through, or you have to use some more sophisticated methods using entanglements and quantum memories. And so there's a lot of infrastructure involved with that. There's also another issue that even if you do all that process perfectly, you have these really nice channels you developed, you still need to know who you're talking to. So Alice needs to know that she's talking to Bob. And that's called the authentication problem. And the authentication problem is usually done using classical crypto. Unless you can just literally see Bob from the distance. You can't be sure it's actually him. So that then begs the question, well, where do you get the security for the authentication? And so this is one of the reasons why the field has largely pushed towards massive communication securely done using post-quantum crypto, which only requires classical communication channels.
So the short answer is quantum cryptography uses quantum resources, and post-quantum cryptography doesn't use any quantum resources at all, but it assumes the adversary does.
Right. So there's the trade-offs again here. So as you're explaining this quantum key distributions, BB84 protocol, it's kind of like the AES. It's still symmetric cryptography, right? So again, we're running into the same problem where it can't be used for a lot of our internet communication. And on top of that, there's the extra problem of hardware. We're not all sitting, actually, this was my undergrad research. I was doing neutral atom quantum memories. Not all of us have a room to put a device in to create these photons. So it's problematic.
It's a major misunderstanding that comes up a lot. People say, oh, well, quantum computers are going to crack our public key crypto bits. Don't worry, we've got quantum cryptography. Well, no, it solves a different problem. The things that can be compromised by quantum computers aren't the symmetric key ciphers that we've got already. We already believe they're quantum robust. So it's solving a problem that's effectively already solved to high confidence, but not addressing the one that faces compromise in the future by quantum computers.
Right. And I think people really like it because it's the idea of, well, it's a physical characteristic. It's not a mathematical problem that we came up. So technically, quantum computers or any other thing can't crack that versus mathematical problems we may find it over time.
Yeah, exactly. This is the distinction between what they call information theoretic security versus computational security. Computational security means you believe that you're secure against an adversary on the basis that their computer is almost certainly not going to be powerful enough to brute force it or apply some sort of crack to it. Whereas information theoretic security means you actually have a proof, a mathematical proof that says this is a no-go. You can't crack this by definition. So QKD is the information theoretically secure version of a symmetric key cipher, whereas AES is one that relies on a computational security assumption, one that we believe is very good and almost certainly is, but it's not quite a proof yet. However, that doesn't mean that QKD is the magic solution either, because it also has problems. Specifically, when you go from the theoretical description, which is information theoretically secure, well, that's all very well on paper, but as soon as you go and build something, there's always a dichotomy between what you think you're building and what you're actually building. A physical implementation of anything is never exactly what's written on the piece of paper. And that's exactly why, at least my personal view would be, I wouldn't rely on QKD right now. I wouldn't, but it's not targeted to any particular vendor or implementation. It's just a matter of principle. It's a new technology. Who knows what vulnerabilities might exist because of implementation issues that haven't been properly studied and worked through.
That's interesting, Peter. So let's say someone could prove to you that their devices were very good. And you believe in quantum mechanics. So you would feel less secure sharing a secret that was done using quantum key distribution versus classical cryptography.
I would. And the reason is that, coming back to this question of the differences between paper and what you build, that gap tends to be much bigger the more precise you become. When you get down to the level of dealing with single qubits that have to be, very specifically individually controlled, we don't want to have any kind of information leakage, right? Because that's what opens up side channel attacks, is if any information escapes outside. Well, okay, suppose someone were to build a QKD system using single photon sources and detectors the way it was originally described. If I wanted to be really convinced that was as secure as I would hope for, I'd want to make sure that those sources, for example, when they produce photons, that there is absolutely no way that they can leak information in any way about the polarization of the photons that they're preparing. And there are so many ways that can happen. And we know that because these things are identified in classical implementations all the time. It wasn't long ago that there was an implementation of one of these new lattice-based methods. It's not that the underlying lattice mathematics was wrong. It was using an alternate attack associated with implementation. Often things like timing attacks can be used, for example, that the execution time of a piece of code might be dependent upon the input that it's acting on, and that leaks information. There's just far more scope for this to happen when you're dealing with something as precise as qubits. And I think the real answer is security comes with trust developed over time. That's the ultimate way that we rely on things and trust them, is that once billions of people have used them and nobody's been hacked, then you can have a lot more confidence than a brand new technology. And quantum is exactly the same.
Yeah, see, I don't know. I think it's very possible that security agencies have cracked some classical cryptographic protocols. And then I would feel less secure than using quantum, even given some imperfections in the physical devices.
I mean, look, I think that maybe the way to reconcile these different lines of thought is that you should treat QKD in this example that we're talking about in the same way that people are treating post-quantum cryptography at the moment. Post-quantum cryptography is a new technology that hasn't had the history of hammering from hackers that our existing products have had. So as people are rolling out post-quantum cryptography libraries, it's happened on, I think Google is doing this, OpenSSH is doing this, the Signal messaging app upgraded their crypto libraries recently, but none of them are just doing a black and white transition from RSA or ECC straight to post-quantum cryptography. They're doing a hybrid model where you're using both simultaneously. And what that means is that it's at least as strong as either of them. So it can't be weaker than what it was because it's still relying on the original one, but an extra layer on top. And that sort of balances out that problem. It's at least as strong as either of them. With QKD, you'd want to do the same thing. You'd say, okay, this is a symmetric cipher. There might be vulnerabilities that aren't properly understood yet. So we definitely wouldn't want to just suddenly switch over to it and trust it. It'd be much more sensible to use it in parallel with existing classical methods and just doubly encrypt to get the security of at least one of them.
And I think that's a good point. Coming back to your original point about we're talking about lattices and hashes and the trust over time. I really like that. That should be a tagline somewhere.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, lattices have been around for a long time in terms of the theory, but they haven't really been used in a lot of places, whereas hashes have been around and have been used. And even though there have been some upgrades like SHA-1, 2, 3, going through that, hashes, yes, have mostly been secure. So people feel a little bit better about that sort of technology versus lattices.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just the history of research effort that has been invested into a technology is one of the most important things for having confidence in the claims or assumptions that are made about that technology.
Right.
Yeah, so actually following up on Peter's suspicion about quantum key distribution is from the fact that there are imperfections in the devices used. And this is absolutely true. I mean, in fact, there have been cases where people have been able to, steal one of the photons that was sent from a bundle of photons known as a weak coherent pulse, and then measure and resend in a way that wasn't detectable and could actually crack. Now, there are countermeasures to make it more robust, but yeah, there are issues there. But you also get issues with classical cryptography. So one of the post-quantum cryptography-based approaches using lattices is called Bliss. And there was a side channel attack on Bliss where it was shown that by monitoring the timing of send and resend in the protocol for using Bliss, that you learn about something about the processing of each step. And from differential timings of processing, this could be done by also monitoring the power consumed by a chip. So you might actually, have some malicious actor who has a little probe on your desktop computer and monitors processing power. And so either by timing or processing power knowledge, that protocol is leaking some information from which you can actually crack it. And that's an example of a imperfect device implementation of a classical cryptographic scheme. So, and it's also one of the motivations for looking at things beyond, say, just lattices or just hash-based, to try to get something which would be device independent, secure.
Yeah, I want to go back to that point because that's really interesting for our listeners. Why that's really interesting that you could intercept that photon and actually maybe not be detected is the idea. There's an idea in quantum technologies called the no cloning theorem. And that says you can't copy a quantum state exactly, which is why this protocol is deemed to be secure. And that's when, Gavin, you were talking about the BB84 protocol. If Eve intercepts everything, Bob and Alice will know. And the no cloning theorem is kind of the broad explanation of why.
Yeah, no. So connecting that back to the previous comments, that's spot on because, the no cloning theorem is really the reason why you can make the statement that QKD is robust against interceptors, eavesdroppers, because you can't duplicate the information and you can't, from a single instance of it, get all of the information in the different bases at once. That's where the security comes from. However, suppose that at the level of where those photons were produced, it wasn't actually a perfect single photon source, and there are many types of single photon sources, and it's not uncommon for them that they may have double emissions. They may produce 2 photons at once instead of 1. If those photons are also correlated, then that can help you get around this no cloning issue, because it means if you can tap out one of them, say using a beam split up or something like that, to get one of them out and let the other one keep going, then you sort of can extract information from the part that you tapped out without destroying anything in between.
And this is also why quantum error correction is so hard, going back to that, because we can't copy the quantum states. So we have to do a lot of clever tricks like that to actually error correct. Whereas in a classical computer, you can just copy the bits a few times and take the majority.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've talked a little bit about blockchains using elliptic curve. So what would the mitigation strategies be for a blockchain that already exists?
That's very much also a blockchain dependent, well, blockchain implementation dependent question, because there's no single notion of a blockchain. It's an abstract concept that, well, as we all know, there are too many implementations out there, far more than you can count. They all differ. And they differ in the flexibility of what you can do with them. But I mean, one thing you can do is a fork, which is something that some major blockchains have done over time to do technological migrations. Like Ethereum did this to change the way their mining system worked, to switch from proof of work to proof of stake, to reduce the resource inefficiency of proof of work. And they did that basically using a fork, which is where everybody just agrees, okay, at a particular point in time, we're just going to suddenly switch to this different technology. So it's basically under agreement. Another thing you might do, depending upon the implementation, is you might say, well, suppose someone was going to attack my wallet, how long would it take them to do so? And as Gavin mentioned, it's not spontaneous. People often have the idea that quantum computers just solve things in a heartbeat, which isn't the case at all. Suppose it takes X hours or days or whatever to crack your wallet. Or you might say, okay, I'll just keep transferring all my funds to new wallets within that time frame on a repeating basis. Or you might say, well, the amount of resources, money, infrastructure that they're going to invest into my wallet, well, I've only got $10 in there, so I can be pretty confident that they're not going to bother to do so on a cost-benefit analysis. You might spread it all out across many wallets. You could do that as well. There are many different ways, and it's not always just about changing technology. It can be about considering, is it worth it to do so? Have they got better things to do with their quantum computers?
So just sort of to summarize, for blockchain, the most critical need for upgrading is in the digital signatures. The mining part is not really such a critical issue. And of course, that depends on whether you're doing what kind of consensus mechanism you're using. But whatever kind of consensus you're using, you always have to have, some authentication that you're talking to who you want to talk, you're interacting and transacting with who you want to. And that's the biggest threat from quantum computers, is on cracking those digital signatures, which the most common used method using elliptic curve based cryptography has an exponential the faster attack with Shor's discrete log algorithm. And the upgrading can in principle be done fairly straightforwardly with post-quantum cryptography, but there are real issues with the in practice method of doing so. The nature of the keys used can be very long, and you can have blow-ups in memory size and time to perform these digital signatures relative to existing classical cryptography. So it's not something that can be just, hire a few coders and go off and use your favorite lattice-based post-quantum crypto. If you want to have people actually work on your network, you don't want it to be too slow or require, large memories. So that's where a lot of the technology is going into, making these things leaner and faster.
So what does it mean for a blockchain to be quantum first?
So that's a good question, because I haven't come across that term actually before, but here's what I'm guessing it means. I'm guessing it means that it's designed from the ground up to utilize exclusively post-quantum cryptographic primitives.
Exactly.
So hash functions, we're pretty confident about that, as discussed. Post-quantum cryptography in general, well, that's that whole area. So we would just exclude things like RSA and ECC from these models. And then you don't have to be even engaging with this whole previous discussion about how do we secure ourselves. It's designed from first principles, and no future migration hopefully will ever be necessary.
Definitely. I wouldn't say a lot, but there's a few blockchains that are coming out saying they're quantum first or they're quantum ready. However, NIST has not officially released standards. We expect that sometime next year. So what is NIST doing to contribute to the development of post-quantum crypto standards?
Well, I mean, NIST is just one example, and perhaps the most prominent, but standards agencies, usually governmental ones, that are responsible for defining standards on things like cryptographic algorithms, they play an extremely important role in the process. Because suppose a researcher came out and published a paper describing a new cryptographic method. Well, I mean, you're not going to just suddenly see widespread adoption. They describe some theoretical model, but there are lots of implementation details that need to be agreed upon. All the parameters need to be compatible in most cases. If different people are going to be having to communicate with one another, they'll need to have configurations that are compatible with one another. So the role of the standards agencies is extremely important in basically providing consensus on agreement on all the implementation details, away from just the underlying theoretical model. And that's a big part of it, because there they have to get things right. What are the right trade-offs for memory and speed, and all these different trade-offs that we've talked about. And until there's consensus on the implementation details, you're not going to have widespread adoption unless it's promoted by some really massive market player, for example. But generally, when it comes to cryptography, you really want it to be open standards, not something that's just pushed by a big company on its own. And so that's where the role comes in. It's not so much in designing the protocols from first principles. It's about getting them to a point where we have agreement on the way to use it, so that everybody who chooses to use it can do so in an intercompatible way that acts in the same way that our current cryptographic products do.
Yeah, I encourage anyone who's watching to just go to the NIST website, just Google post-quantum cryptography NIST, and go to some of the candidates, and you'll see like a list of the different candidates. There'll be some for digital signatures and for general cryptography, public key cryptography. And then if you see any link that's in comments, it's almost assuredly someone's found an attack. And you can just click on that, and it's like, internet in the 90s. It's just like someone write us an email like, oh yeah, I found a way to crack this. And they'll just give a list of, like, this is what you do. And, here's an example of a key I broke. And it's great because, it's undeniable proof right there in front of you that something didn't work. And that's really the essence of open standards. And NIST has been great about this.
I mean, this is an important part of it too. It's not as though these standard agencies are just dictators who just walk in and say, right, this is the standard. These processes are always highly interactive with the community. By community, I mean anyone with an interest in these technologies. And that interaction and feedback process, that's very much fundamental to getting things right, because it's during that process of refining what the implementation details are where people might identify side channel attacks, as has happened on many occasions in the past. So it shouldn't be thought of as just an agency coming in and saying, right, this is what we're doing. It's more that they're mediating a process in a well-considered way that leads us towards an outcome that everybody can have a lot of confidence in.
Yeah, but also, things are going to change in the future, right? So right now, all those comments, those are all classical attacks. Someone has done it on their laptop, or maybe it took, distributed computing of many cores. But it's all classical. At some point, we're going to have people that will be able to actually use quantum computers to try to attack some of these things. And some of them probably will fall. It's very hard to analyze something without access to the quantum computer. And I think people are seriously talking about quantum computers being large enough by the early 2030s to potentially attack some of the existing classical cryptography. And so, we should be expecting that, not too long after that, they'll be able to try to attack some of these proposed post-quantum cryptographic protocols.
Yeah, I think the open source standards are pretty much required at this point. No one's going to trust anything just put out by a company. But I think there's a really interesting, like you mentioned, someone will put something out and then it'll just be someone else in the comments saying, hey, we found something different, because sometimes these standards are developed kind of in a vacuum, right? So I think in the episode with Chenmo, we talked about the fact that they have people both on the cryptography side and the physics side working together. And that's a really different perspective and is only available because of industry. Because, back in the day and even now in academia and research, labs tend to be within one specific department. So you only have one type of expertise, and this opens it up to everyone. And that's the same thing in quantum computing, right? We have these algorithms, but they were developed by quantum physicists. What happens when a chemist gets their hands on a quantum computer, or someone else with a completely different take? A lot of things could happen.
That's exactly right. It really, when it comes to things like security, it's absolutely essential that it be looked at in a holistic way. You wouldn't just get theoretical cryptographers on board to make all the decisions. You'd get people involved in who designs the chips that do the hardware enhanced implementations of these, and how do we study what's going on in there, and whether there are any information leakages that might provide vulnerabilities like that. That's hugely important. And in the case of anything quantum, it's not just about theoretical physicists, it's about who's building the experiments, how are the devices inside those built. So absolutely, you need to get everyone involved, and that's exactly where these standard agencies have a greater capacity to do that than, for example, an academic working in a particular research direction.
Definitely. So I feel like maybe we're pretty doom and gloom sometimes on this podcast talking about the security aspect. And I asked this question recently on Twitter, and I was wondering what your response would be, because I got some interesting responses here. So people are talking about regulating the development of AI due to the fear of AGI taking over and killing us all. I, for one, am thinking about it and being really happy that the progress of quantum computing is not being stopped by the threat of breaking encryption. But why do you think that is?
Yeah, but when it comes to AI, I can see where people are coming from. It does raise lots of ethical concerns. There's room for regulation, but I don't agree with this idea that I think Elon Musk might have been the one who raised it, that you should just put a halt on it, ban it. Like, that is not something that ever works with technology. You don't remove the threat of destructive technology by banning it, because it just means that...
Well, to be fair, he said put a pause for 6 months.
Exactly. But that's effectively a temporary ban. And like, obviously only good actors are actually going to abide by that, which just tilts the whole spectrum in favor of the bad people. And that's the last thing you want. So quantum computing is no different in my mind. When it comes to any new technology, there's always a creative, destructive aspect to it, where it can be used for good or bad. and that's just something that needs to be accepted as the inherent nature of technological advancement. As soon as you try and prohibit or prevent the bad inhibit a whole technology because of the subset of bad outcomes that it might have, that's where you start going into dangerous territory where you can achieve something very, very counterproductive.
Yeah, my own view on this is I don't think it's the role of government to try to preempt technological developments on a problem that is already being pursued. I mean, people are already using classical computers to try to crack crypto. We don't see big programs to limit the number of cores you can have in your computer. And I think actually a more important role for government is going to think seriously about equity in terms of power imbalances that will develop with this massive technology. Internationally, some countries are more developed than others, and this gap is just going to widen dramatically once quantum computers hit the scene. And there'll be the haves and the have-nots. And, most of the quantum computing processing will be accessible first over the cloud. Who's going to be able to afford leasing time on a quantum computer? Well, it's going to be the people that live in the developed countries. And when you have assets that are determined based upon security, those assets are going to be vulnerable, particularly for those people in countries who don't have the resources to access quantum computing. So I think this is something that governments need to think seriously about, because it could be destabilizing geopolitically.
My favorite response on this one was that there's been a bunch of movies in Hollywood about AGI taking over, but quantum computing isn't evil yet. And actually, the quantum realm saved us from Thanos. So we're the good guys so far. So that's why we're not being shut down yet.
I think maybe there's not this sense of emergency when it comes to quantum computing, because it's something that most people wouldn't have a good appreciation for what the risks of quantum computing is to begin with, because it's something very detached from our normal way of going about everyday computing, and people don't relate to it so well. But as soon as you have an app on your phone that has this backend to a large language model that just has this incredible superhuman capability, and you can play with it yourself and say, wow, I can do this all of a sudden. Imagine what I could do if I decided to become a scammer. It's just immediately apparent. God, I could play tricks on people with this technology if I scripted it up and used it to create fake channels or whatever. I mean, there's a much more natural sense of connection to what the immediacy of the threat is. And I think that's very much the reason why AGI gets a lot more attention as being something that's urgent as compared to quantum computing, where they're saying, well, in 30 years, they might be able to break a key that doesn't matter to me anymore. I mean, most people are sort of oblivious to security. Most people don't even bother to use encrypted chat messages anymore.
Yeah, I'm just much more worried about what people naturally do to threaten each other. I mean, if you suddenly have a new technology which is going to make you a lot of money, that's already destabilizing. And you see this already in AI. People who have investments in these companies, their portfolios are going to blow up. And well, what do people with money do? Well, they exert political influence, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. This is the most natural thing, I think, as a threat. And new technologies which enable new capabilities, giving you an edge, that's going to create imbalances. And I mean, as humans, we have to come up with good ways to think about mitigating the risks from that.
Well, it looks like for at least the three of us, we still have jobs so far. We're not going to be banned from working on this. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us today on the episode of The Quantum State. The next roundtable, we'll talk more about the state of quantum computing, the hardware, and more about the challenges that quantum development is facing to get to the needed qubit counts to actually break this encryption. So not only to run the algorithms, but also maybe destroy the world. So make sure to subscribe to our channels wherever you can find your podcasts and on YouTube, and like this episode and join us next time. Thank you, Peter and Gavin, for joining.
Thanks, Anastasia.
Thanks.